Let's go ahead and get started. We'll be working from the book Tactics tonight. Tonight, we want to just start a 3-part series working with some of the concepts in the book. I think these are really good concepts. I feel like a lot of the things that we want to naturally do in our conversations with people in terms of transitioning to spiritual things, I feel like the Tactics book really puts some feet on it, so to speak. Maybe you wouldn't use exactly what he teaches there or what he says, but my hope is that maybe it gives you some creative ideas on how you can incorporate some of the things that he recommends into your day-to-day conversations with people. It's all about equipping. You never know what tool you'll need for a specific situation. The goal is like any handyman. Believers should view themselves like a handyman with a tool belt. We want to have as many tools on that belt as possible. It doesn't mean we're going to use the same tool all the time. That was always the big joke about Donald Trump, right? That he viewed every problem as a nail and he was the hammer. And that's how he handled every situation. But yet many times we as believers can do that too. We try to learn maybe one tool and we try to just cram that into every situation. It just doesn't work that way. And part of the reason I think the Lord wants us to be equipped, but he also wants us to learn to walk by faith. If everything was, you could read a book about it and know exactly what to do, we never have to depend on the Lord. We want to get equipped, but we also want to learn how to walk by faith and trust the Lord. And we need to feel dependent in every situation that we have for evangelism, because that's when the Lord is going to be able to work through us as we depend upon him. Tonight, when we start getting into tactics, if I could title the night with a different subtitle, I want to title it The Art of Asking Good Questions. So many of us naturally, well, maybe I shouldn't speak for everybody. I think this is probably a shared experience. So many of us, when we view evangelism, we view sharing the gospel with somebody, we typically start thinking about what we're going to say. Okay, what am I going to say? How am I going to word this? We start thinking through all of the arguments we're going to put forth. And really, what I love about this approach with tactics, and it's been so helpful in my own life as well, is it's really trying to encourage us to learn how to become artful in the questions that we ask. Knowing that if we ask good questions, good thought-provoking questions, then oftentimes it leads to a natural conversation about the gospel. What you'll find in general, and again, these are just some intro comments before we get to the notes. What you'll find in general, and this is true across the board, when you ask people their opinion or you ask them questions and you begin to ask questions in such a way that you're through the questions pointing out that maybe their theory has holes in it or has flaws in it, many times it's at that point that people will then volley the tennis ball back over to you and say, well, what do you think, John? What do you think? What is the answer to this question? I've seen that happen in business meetings over the years. As I've worked secular jobs, I've seen that happen in evangelistic conversations where you begin to really pepper them with questions and they realize, I really don't know what I'm talking about. I really don't have good answers to these questions. So since this guy or this gal is asking me really good questions, I'm going to ask what they think. So oftentimes it just opens, now you've got permission to share the gospel and they actually want to hear from you. This artful skill of asking good questions, I think, is what we want to take away from tonight. So this is Tactics Part 1. We want to do a 3-part study on the book of Tactics. I want to just read the story of the witch in Wisconsin, and then I want to make some comments on that. Before we read the story, many of you have probably already read it. Just notice how natural he moves through the conversation. Notice how he listens very well. His next question is based on his understanding of what she's saying and how to move the conversation forward. Just a real artful conversation. And clearly this guy has thought through this process. So he's giving an example here and you might even feel like, wow, I could never do something like that. Maybe we never get to his level, but I think we can grow in this and just try to pick up some things that he does here. I'm reading The Witch in Wisconsin. So we may have different editions, but it's in chapter 1, Diplomacy or D-Day. Several years ago, while on vacation at our family cabin in Wisconsin, my wife and I stopped at the 1-hour photo in town. I noticed that the woman helping us had a large pentagram, a 5-pointed star generally associated with the occult, dangling from her neck. As we go through this, I just want you to picture yourself in this situation. You look over, you see the pentagram, and what are you thinking at this point? Are you like, well, I'm going to get out of here as quick as I can? Oh, wow, there's a Satanist here taking my money in the 1-hour photo lab? Or are you thinking, I'm going to engage in conversation, see where this thing goes? Well, this guy says, I'm going to engage in conversation. What he does is he notices that on her and he says, does that star have any religious significance? I asked, pointing to the pendant. Or is it just jewelry? Yes, it has religious significance, she answered. The 5 points stand for earth, wind, fire, water, and spirit. Then she added, I'm a pagan. My wife, caught off guard by the woman's candor, couldn't suppress a laugh, then quickly apologized. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. It's just that I have never heard anyone actually admit right out that they were a pagan, she explained. She knew the term only as a pejorative used by her friends yelling at their kids, get in here, you bunch of pagans. So you're a Wiccan, I continued. Now, you would have to have some kind of background to know that this pentagram and this earth, wind, fire, water, and spirit was connected to being a Wiccan. And for some of you, that might be the first time you've heard that term. But there are people who identify themselves as Wiccan. There were some celebrities that came out years ago, and so it became cool for some people. But basically what they're saying is they're a witch. They believe they're a witch. I've met a few of them, but most of the ones I've met don't even know what they're talking about. It's just kind of like they thought it was a cool thing to be, I guess. But this gal in the story looks like she's a little bit more knowledgeable. She nodded. Yes, she was a witch. It's an earth religion, the woman explained. Like the Native Americans, we respect all life. Notice now how he's going to take that last phrase. He's going to work with it now. Oh, if you respect all life, I said, then I suppose you're pro-life on the abortion issue. So again, we're making observations. He used something she says, and then he moves the conversation forward with a question. She shook her head. No, actually, I'm not. I'm pro-choice. I was surprised. Isn't that an unusual position for someone in Wicca to take? I mean, since you're committed to respecting all life? She said, you're right, it is odd, she admitted, then quickly qualified herself. I know I could never do that. I mean, I could never kill a baby. I wouldn't do anything to hurt anyone else because it might come back on me. Now, this was a remarkable turn in the conversation for two reasons. First, notice the words she used to describe abortion. By her own admission, abortion was baby killing. The phrase wasn't a rhetorical flourish of mine. These were her own words. I did not have to persuade her that abortion took the life of an innocent human being. She already knew it. She had just offered me a tremendous leg up in the discussion, and I was not going to turn it down. From then on, I abandoned the word abortion. It would be baby killing. Instead, taking her words and just reusing them in his conversation. Because we have such a negative image, at least I do, when you say, well, I'm using your words against you. Kind of seems negative. But in a sense, that's what you're doing. You're listening for words that could help advance this conversation, in terms of asking questions and those kind of things. Second, he goes on, I thought it remarkable that her first reason for not hurting a defenseless child was self-interest. Notice what she says at the end up there. She says, something bad might befall her. Is that the best she could do? I thought to myself, this comment itself was worth pursuing, but I ignored it and took a different tack. Well, maybe you wouldn't do anything to hurt a baby, but other people would, I countered. Shouldn't we do something to stop them from killing babies? She said, I think women should have a choice, she countered without thinking. Generally, statements like women should have a choice are meaningless as they stand. Like the statement, I have a right to take. The claim requires an object. Choose what? Take what? No one has an open-ended right to choose. People only have the right to choose particular things. Whether anyone has a right to choose depends entirely on what choice they have in mind. In this case, though, there's no ambiguity. The woman had already identified the choice, baby killing, to use her words. Even though she personally respected all life, human life, this was not a belief she was comfortable forcing on others. Women should still have the choice to kill their own babies. That was her view. Of course, she did not put it in so many words. This was her view implicitly. When bizarre ideas like these are obviously implied, do not let them lurk in the shadows. Drag them into the light with a request for clarification. That's exactly what I did next. Now, we're going to get to the Columbo method, but this is really that first step. Well, what do you mean by that? I'm confused. You say you value life, but you think other women should have the right to choose to kill their babies. I'm kind of confused. How does that fit together? That would be a question. He goes on to say it this way. Do you mean women should have the choice to kill their own babies? Well, she thought for a moment. I think all things should be taken into consideration on this question. Okay, tell me, what kind of considerations would make it all right to kill a baby? See how he's taking what she says and then basing his next question on what she says. And he's kind of moving the conversation forward. And that's why it's going very naturally. He's not skipping steps. He's just taking her response, asking a question. Taking her response, asking another question. And you can see how he's moving naturally through that. He says, okay, tell me, what kind of considerations would make it all right to kill a baby? Incest, she quickly answered. Let me see if I understand. Let's just say I had a 2-year-old child standing next to me who had been conceived as a result of incest. On your view, it seems I should have the liberty to kill her. Is that right? This last question stopped her in her tracks. The notion was clearly absurd. It was also clear that she was deeply committed to her pro-choice views. She had no snappy response and had to pause for a moment and think. Finally, she said, I'd have mixed feelings about that. It was the best she could do. Of course, she meant this as a concession, but it was a desperately weak response. Killing a 2-year-old? Gee, you got me on that one. I'll have to think about it. I hope so, was all I had the heart to say in response. At this point, I noticed a line of would-be customers forming behind me. Our conversation was now interfering with her work. It was time to abandon the pursuit. My wife and I finished our transaction, wished her well, and departed. Really some neat things coming out of that conversation. First of all, in terms of your notes, that very first point, as we look back, notice there was no tension, anxiety, or awkwardness in the exchange. It flowed very naturally. Imagine the opposite, which probably many of us have engaged in naturally. Imagine having a conversation about pro-life and pro-choice issues, but you being the one lecturing on it, or you giving a monologue on it. This was a very different approach. He was making his points, but he was doing it through questions, and he was doing it with questions based on the very last statement. And so that's just why it kind of had a natural flow to the conversation. Number 2, notice again the author was in complete control of the conversation, even though he was not doing the majority of the talking. In fact, just challenges our normal thinking when we're talking to people, when we're having a conversation to people, that if we're going to control the conversation, we got to be the one doing all the talking. And this is a great example of a man who was controlling and steering the conversation, but he was not doing the majority of the talking. The real work that he did was to listen closely to her responses and then steer the exchange through questions and the direction he wanted it to go. And this right here is a skill set that I think that we can develop, and I would encourage us to develop, because you want to steer conversations through questions, not a monologue lecture. There are going to be times when you're going to get to speak in a monologue where they're listening to you, but early on in conversations, as we're trying to transition to the gospel especially, we're trying to keep them as involved as possible. We're trying to move the conversation through questions. But you can kind of see an example of how he did that. His main goal was to expose the witch's bad thinking for the purpose of guiding her to truth. His aim was to manage the conversation, not manipulate or control her, but to get her thinking and to expose the fact that her thinking was not good. It was faulty. It had lots of holes in it. So you can see that he accomplished that very well. And then, very important point to consider. Most people, even the smart ones, even the ones who have the pedigrees, the professors, the doctorate degrees, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, they do not really think through their objections to Christianity. Our goal with these types of people is to really get them to consider the issues. We do that again, hopefully through just improving this skill of asking the right questions. Years ago, I was at the store. We've got them down here. Of course, I don't know if they're in Canada. I don't know if they're up north. They might be. They're called Five Below. Basically, it's a store where a little bit better than Dollar Tree. I guess the toys last a little bit longer than a couple hours from Dollar Tree. Everything in the store is $5 and below. Anyways, I was talking to a cashier there. She was checking me out at the register. And there was nobody behind me when I was first there. I could see in her hand, she was scanning something, and she had these beads in her other hand. I thought it was a Catholic rosary is what I thought it was. And sure enough, it was. And I said, hey, I noticed you've got those beads in your hand. I said, is that a rosary? And she said, yeah. I said, are you Catholic? And she said, yeah, I'm Catholic. And I said, wow. I said, is that something that you use all the time in your prayers? Because typically, I guess, they pray the rosary. I don't know all the details. But anyways, I said, is that something you use a lot in your prayer, in your prayers? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, how do you use that? I don't know if anyone's ever explained that to me. And she was just talking about, well, I say, the Lord's Prayer and Our Father. And then I say, a certain amount of Hail Marys. And then she was just kind of walking me through that. I said, I was reading my Bible the other day, and I actually had been reading in that section. The Lord's Prayer is recorded in Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. And just before the Lord's Prayer, Jesus says, don't pray in vain repetition like the heathen do. And don't just repeat words that have no meaning, or don't just make long prayers for the sake of people seeing you. It's kind of all in that section. So I told her, I was like, yeah, it's interesting because I was just reading in the section with the Lord's Prayer. I was reading my Bible the other day. And right before it, Jesus says, don't pray in vain repetition, meaning don't just repeat prayers just to repeat them. And I said, hey, I wonder why do you think that's in there next to the Lord's Prayer? And right about that time, there were 3 or 4 people in line right behind me, and she had finished up the transaction. And she just said, oh, wow, I don't know. I don't know why that would be the case. And again, it was a similar situation as the witch. I was like, well, okay, well, hey, nice talking to you. I guess I'll let you serve these folks. It's that concept we talked about last week that Tactics does, I think, a real good job of just bringing up over and over again. Don't put pressure on yourself to harvest. Just put a pebble in their shoe. We're looking to put a pebble in their shoe. We're looking to challenge their thinking. The goal is to hopefully be able to guide them to truth, but if we're not the ones that get to do that, we want to be a step in the process to challenge their thinking, put something in their shoe that they can't let go of. The second section I wanted to look at, there's a quote. It's in the Reservations chapter. It's under the section, Do Arguments Work? And it's a quote from the author's wife's mentor. The book says this, and then her mentor chimes in, but it says, have you ever noticed that sometimes your comments seem to fall on deaf ears, and yet at other times they seem profitable? When I share my faith, Kathy told me, I pay attention to how the sheep respond. Most will keep on eating grass, but once in a while you'll notice that some lift their heads. There's a moment of recognition as they hear the Good Shepherd's voice. Kathy understood that it was Jesus' job to change the heart. Since she was confident the Holy Spirit was going before her, she was simply looking for the people who were looking for her, so to speak. She was looking for those already hungry for the gospel, those whose hearts were already being softened by the Spirit. Those were the people she spent her time on. She left the rest alone. And I think that's such a great point, especially when we're talking to somebody. We're trying to move the conversation along with questions. At some level, hopefully in their body language, in their engagement with the conversation, we're going to be able to see, oh, the Lord has prepared this person for further conversation. Hopefully that's something that's recognizable. But like we've said before, the author says multiply, never sets out with the primary goal of converting somebody to Christianity, but rather with a primary goal of putting a pebble in their shoe. To use a baseball analogy, you're not trying to hit a home run every at bat. You're trying to get a good at bat. You're trying to see the ball well. You're trying to make contact. You're trying to cause the pitcher to throw as many pitches as he can, because later in the game, when he's reached his pitch count, he's going to have to get pulled out of the game, and then you could face maybe a subpar pitcher, maybe not their star pitcher. Lots of things going on in a baseball game. If everyone got up every at bat and tried to hit a home run, you wouldn't have a very good baseball team. In fact, I played in the minor leagues. Some of you know that. I played in the minor leagues for the Colorado Rockies for about 3 years. And what really shocked me is in the minor leagues, the coaches have to send a scouting report or a report on each of the players after every game. They send that to the head scouting office, the general manager, the director of minor league player personnel. So they've got all these reports on every minor league player. What's fascinating is they didn't even care about your batting average. They didn't necessarily care about how many home runs you hit. They didn't care about any of that. What they cared about were good at bats. And so the scouting report on John Clark after a game, I might have gotten 2 hits out of 4 at bats, which is good. I went 2 for 4. But they may have written back to the home office, he had 0 quality at bats. And what that means is maybe I got jammed on a fastball and I popped it up to right field and it barely fell in between 3 guys. And I didn't hit it well. I kind of got lucky. Or the next time I took a big swing and I hit this little topper over the middle and it just barely got out of the reach of the shortstop. It was a terrible ball, but I ended up getting 2 hits out of it. Well, let's say one of my other teammates, he got 0 hits on the night. He had made 4 outs. He might get written back to the home office that he had 4 quality at bats because he hit a line drive to the center fielder and he hit a line drive to the left fielder, and he would have had a home run to right field, but the outfielder went above the fence and pulled it back, and then he hit a bullet to the third baseman and he threw him out at first. So he had 4 quality at bats. This is the concept of evangelism, turning conversation to spiritual things. We're not looking to hit a home run every time. We don't need to put that kind of pressure on ourselves. We're just looking to have a quality conversation where we put a pebble in their shoe. We challenge their thinking. We move the conversation forward so that maybe they'll be ready for the next conversation to move it into a gospel conversation where they'll trust Christ. Again, not every Christian is a closer or a harvester, but we can be really good, ordinary gardeners. Honestly, we always think of the harvester as the one who's going to bear fruit in evangelism. And we always put pressure on ourselves. Oh, I've never led anybody to the Lord. I'm never going to bear fruit in evangelism. Even if you're the one planting and watering, but you never harvest, you still may bear fruit. And let me just add a Bible verse here, a Bible passage, 1 Corinthians 3, verses 6 through 8. It says this, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then, neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Verse 8, now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one, notice this, each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. And what this tells us is that God values the ordinary gardener just as much as he values the harvester. Now, in our days, the harvester always gets more glory, doesn't he? That or she does. Those are the people at church that are like, wow, everyone just, this guy or this gal's incredible, because we always hold up the harvester as like the closer, the top dog, so to speak. And God views it much differently. We need to have a divine perspective on this whole process, and hopefully that gives all of us the encouragement that we need to just be part of the process. Just do our part with a goal, again, of advancing the conversation, putting a pebble in their shoe, challenging their thinking. Sometimes I think we get so focused on harvesting, we get so discouraged when we don't see a harvest that we quit even going to the field as Christians. And that's what we want to avoid. Now, there's some other great examples here. It's in the reservations chapter under the section called a modest goal. Let me just read these two examples. The first one's about a Jewish attorney. He says, a few years back, I spoke to a Jewish attorney who didn't understand why he needed to believe in Jesus. In his case, I didn't try to build to a point of decision where I asked, do you want to receive Christ? Instead, I put a stone in his shoe. I gave him two questions to think about. He needed to digest vital information before he'd be ready for a genuine commitment. I don't like that terminology there, just FYI, but before he'd be ready to trust in Christ, I would say it differently. But if he ever made a decision to trust Christ, I wanted it to be informed and thoughtful, a choice that lasted, not an emotional reaction made in the heat of the moment that he'd later abandon. Listen to that approach. He's not pushing for a decision there because at some level he realizes that the guy he's speaking to still has some reservations. So he tries to plant a pebble in his shoe. He tries to put a stone there to give him something to think about later. He doesn't view himself as the only person on earth that's going to convert this guy. He views himself as part of the process. Just below that, he gives another example. And I think this is another great example of this mindset. He says, one spring I spoke in San Diego to an audience of 400 students in a ballroom in the middle of the University of California campus there. Most were not Christians. I'd heard that the general attitude on campus was that Christians were stupid. That sounded like a good opener for my talk. He said, I understand many of you think Christians are stupid. I said to the audience, well, many of them are, I admitted, but many non-Christians are stupid too. So I don't know how that helps you. What I want to do this evening is to show you that Christianity is not stupid. Then I shared with them my modest goal. I'm not here to convert you tonight, I said. Instead, I want to put a stone in your shoe. After that, I lectured on the failure of relativism. I wasn't there to close the sale. I just wanted to give them something to think about. As it turned out, while taking questions from the audience afterward, I was able to give more detail about the gospel, but only after I'd laid the groundwork by making the message not only sensible to them, but reasonable. I took one step at a time. Just another great, I think, story, giving this as an example. I've got a personal example of this. I was at a county fair in Texas, and we were doing our survey evangelism, and a lady sat down at the table and she said, I'm Jewish. And I said, great. And she said, yeah, so you'll never be able to change my mind. I'm Jewish. I'm committed to Judaism. You'll never be able to change my mind. And so I thought, okay, this is going to be a tough nut to crack. But I thought, you know what? I want to plant a seed. I want to plant a pebble in her shoe. And so I began to pray and just ask the Lord to give me wisdom. And what I came up with in the moment was this. I said, well, okay, well, you're a Jew, so I've got a question for you. I've never understood this before. And she said, yeah, shoot. I said, the Old Testament is full of animal sacrifices, blood sacrifices for sin. And I said, and it's my understanding, maybe you could correct me, it's my understanding that those blood sacrifices atoned or provided an atonement covering for sins. And I said, am I right in that? She said, yeah, you're right. You're exactly right. And I said, since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, what's taken the place of those animal sacrifices? Don't you still need your sins atoned for and covered? And funny enough, she had never thought about that question. She had never even considered why she had grown up as a little girl going to synagogue, and they had never once sacrificed a lamb. Even their Passover Seders were nothing like what she read about in the book of Exodus. And she said, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. And I had done some reading on it. And I said, I had heard in Israel that many people now on the Day of Atonement, they will cut the head off of a chicken and they'll take the chicken's legs and they'll swing it around over their heads. And people try to get in under the blood. And I said, have you ever heard of that? And she said, no, I've never heard of that. And she said, that just sounds ridiculous. That's not even the sacrificial system. I said, yeah, that's what I thought too. And I said, I know you're not interested in Christianity, but Christianity has an answer to the question I asked you. Is that something you'd be interested in hearing? And she said, no, I'm Jewish. I don't want to hear anything from the New Testament. But I was encouraged to know that I think I was able to put a pebble in her shoe. And that's what we're talking about in this section. The rest of the study, we want to talk about the Columbo tactic. Columbo was an old television show where he was a detective, very good at detective. He kind of looked like a bumbling idiot, so to speak, but he was very sly as a fox. He really had a way of asking the right questions and really noticing things. And he would say, oh, just one more question. And then he would nail people. He would act like a real friendly, kind of disorganized guy. And then he would ask a question to let the bad guy know he's got him. He's nailed him. And so this Columbo tactic, as it's referred to in the book of Tactics, is really kind of the basis for everything in the book. What is it? Well, the key is to go on the offensive in an inoffensive way. Again, by using carefully selected questions to productively advance the conversation. And we could put it this way. Simply put, never make a statement, at least at first, when a question will do the job. Again, we are so wired to think that if somebody says something wrong, we're going to just jump in there and correct them. We're just going to make a statement, make a bunch of statements. We're going to go on a monologue and quote 400 verses to them and prove that we're right. And what this method says, especially in a conversational setting, is don't make a statement if you can use a question to do it. If a question will do the same job, use a question. It's just a better way to advance a conversation. It's less combative. It forces the other person to think. Gives you additional ammo, so to speak, if you listen well and grab hold of, to ask more questions or to point out the flaws in their thinking. Basically, with this method, you are not taking the burden of proof upon yourself. In fact, you're stiff-arming that. You're keeping it away from you. You're keeping the burden of proof on the other person. Instead, you accomplish your goal a very different way through questions designed to point out flaws in one's thinking. A lot of times this will come up. Someone will say, well, I don't believe there's a God. And then we immediately go into a monologue, a series of statements. Well, you should believe in God because this, and this. And we break out all the, if you've been into theology or apologetics, you break out the ontological proofs. You break out any kind of creation proofs. You may break out the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, you're ready. You're studied up and you're going to let them know how much you know. When really a great way to respond to somebody that says, I don't believe in God, say, well, why is that? How did you come to that conclusion? And let them talk. See, now the burden of proof is on them. Once you start making statements, you have taken the burden of proof on you, and now it's your job to prove that there is a God. Well, that's not even how the conversation started. They made the statement. They need to back it up. They need to prove it. Okay, that's their burden, not yours. The other thing is when you ask questions, sincere questions are friendly and flattering because they invite genial interaction, polite interaction on a topic that's generally important to the other person. They're the one that brought it up with the story earlier of the witch in Wisconsin. She was the one that said she believed in earth, wind, fire, etc., and that she was a pagan. So it gives us the opportunity. It says, what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? Oh, it means that we're for all life. And then we use that statement to move to the next question. You can see it's a less combative way to move a conversation, and something that I would encourage each one of us to spend time thinking through how we can grow in the use of this type of discussion. Get an education. This was a great point in the book. Instead of researching someone's beliefs on the internet and then having in your mind a very confrontational got-ya meeting full of difficult questions for your unsuspecting acquaintance, grab a notepad and just ask him or her exactly what they believe. That's what we do a lot of times. It's like, I work with a Jehovah's Witness. I need to know everything the Jehovah's Witness believes. I need to know every one of their doctrinal deviations. I need to have verses ready to nail them on all these things or to tell them why they're wrong. Whereas probably the best way to do it is just to say, hey, you're Jehovah's Witness. Can we sit down? I'd love to talk to you about what you believe. I've heard of lots of different things I've read on the internet, but I'd really love to hear from you what you believe on some certain things. And take a notepad. Ask them. Sit down with them. Show interest. What's really interesting about that, there's something in the human psyche even that when you take the position of a learner in front of somebody else, oftentimes it's just the polite thing for them to now reciprocate and say, what do you believe? I'd be curious to hear what you think about all these things. And then it may give you an opportunity to move into a gospel conversation. If it doesn't, it gives you some really good footholds to converse with your acquaintance further in the future. Hey, you remember when we had that conversation? You said you believe this. I was thinking about that. I'm having trouble reconciling something you said with what I saw in the Bible. Maybe you could help me. And then go from there. I think that's a great advice. Get an education and let the person educate you. Don't just go get educated on the internet. You can do that too, but don't miss an opportunity, I guess, to converse with somebody and possibly gain a foothold to springboard into sharing the gospel. Good thing about questions, they allow you to make progress on a point without seeming pushy. All the pressure is on the other person because you have not communicated a point that you're trying to make. They have communicated the points. You are simply clarifying what they mean. You're not being pushy. You're not pushing your opinion. You haven't even told them what your opinion is. You're simply asking them questions. You're simply clarifying what they mean. And that really brings us to step one of the Columbo method, which is, what does someone think? And the question here is basically, what do you mean by that? What do you mean? In the example earlier with the witch in Wisconsin, his what do you mean by that question was, does that star have any religious significance? That's kind of an example of this first step of Columbo. Or you believe in let's see, how did he word that again? Let me go back. She actually just volunteered it. I was going to say, if he said, she nodded, said she was a witch, it's an earth religion. The woman explained, like the Native Americans, we respect all life. If she would have just said it's an earth religion, kind of like the Native Americans, you could say, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean it's like the Native? In what way is it like the Native Americans? What's really great about this question is a lot of times it can buy you time. As you're praying and asking for the Lord wisdom, just having this step one down and ready to go can buy you some time in the conversation. Some examples that he used in the book, someone's like, oh, it's relative. And you could say, well, what do you mean by relative? Is everything relative? Would that apply to your own statement as well? Or is everything else relative except when you speak? That might be a little bit more direct of a conversation question. But what do you mean by relative? Is everything relative? So is the statement you just made relative too? Or was that true? Was that kind of an absolute truth that you said? If everything's relative, that sounds like an absolute statement. So if it's relative, then is everything not relative? It's kind of confusing. So that's kind of a what do you mean by that question. Follow up with, let me be sure I understand what you are saying is XYZ. So again, these are just ways to follow up. What do you mean by that? Okay, let me be sure I understand what you're saying is blank, blank, blank. And as I said earlier, in a tough situation when you do not know what to say, This question can actually buy you some time to think, buy you some time to pray, most likely. And even if you don't, if you can't get up a well-worded prayer and your prayer is the equivalent of help, I think the Lord wants to assist and guide us. And I think that's very important to know. I want to go to the book for a second. And I want to go to chapter 3. We're going to read through these scenes really quickly. Just want to challenge you to say, how would you work through that situation? I hope you're doing that as you read through the book, just taking a time to say, man, how would I handle that situation? We'll look at his responses that he gives. Let's look at scene 1. Scene 1, you're hosting a dinner party at your home for some of your close friends from church. The conversation ranges naturally over a number of interesting spiritual topics. Suddenly, to your surprise and embarrassment, your 15-year-old son announces with some belligerence that he doesn't believe in God anymore. It's simply not rational, he says. There is no proof. You had no idea he'd be moving in this direction. There's a stunned silence. What will you say? That would be a crazy situation, wouldn't it? I mean, you'd hope your son would talk to you about that before you had a group over. But now you're on the spot. How would you employ the Columbo tactic? Well, I don't want to put you guys on the spot and wait until someone answers, because he gives some answers there on the next page. And notice how he responds. What do you mean by God? That is, what kind of God do you reject? What specifically is irrational about believing in God? Since you are concerned about God's existence, what kind of evidence would you find acceptable? So that's an example of starting out with this first step of the Columbo tactic. I mean, that would definitely catch you off guard if your son said that. This could buy you some time, but you're also digging into what he says. There's no proof. Well, yeah, what kind of proof would you accept if there was proof that existed? Or he says, belief in God is not rational. Well, what specifically do you find irrational about it? I'd be curious. These are questions. You're not lecturing him. You're not saying, shut up, we'll talk about that later. Don't say that. You don't believe that. I know, we taught you better. You're not just dictating. You're asking a question. You're making that 15-year-old think. He probably just repeated it from some YouTube celebrity. I mean, who knows where he got it from. But that's scene 1. Go to scene 2. It's the night of your weekly Bible study group. During the discussion of the Sunday sermon on the Great Commission, a newcomer remarks, who are we to say Christianity is better than any other religion? I think the essence of Jesus' teaching is love, the same as all religions. It's not our job to tell other people how to live or believe. The rest of the group fidgets awkwardly but says nothing. How do you respond? That would be awkward. Immediately you want to dive in and start lecturing them on why they're wrong. But notice again on the next page how he handles this. How much have you studied other religions to compare the details and find a common theme? Why would the similarities be more important than the differences? I'm curious, what do you think Jesus' own attitude was on this issue? You might even add, did Jesus comment on this issue in the scriptures? And you could go to John 14:6. Yeah, he did. Where did he comment on that? Do you know? Did he think basically all religions were basically equal? Isn't telling people to love one another just another example of telling them how they should live and believe? So again, just some very logical questions using what this person in the Bible study said to keep the burden of proof on them and to challenge their thinking. Most people, this isn't always the case, but most people are just parroting something that they've heard somebody else say. They haven't thought through it themselves. And so this Columbo method is a great way to get them to start thinking about what they've said, what they really believe. Look at scene 3. You're riding the university shuttle with a friend who notices a Bible in your backpack. I've read the Bible before, he says. It's got some interesting stories, but people take it too seriously. It was only written by men after all, and men make mistakes. You try to recall the points your pastor made a few weeks earlier about the Bible's inspiration, but you come up empty-handed. What do you say? Some of the responses he gives on the next page are, well, do you have any books in your library? Were those books written by humans? Do you find any truth in them? Is there a reason you think the Bible is less truthful or reliable than other books you own? Do people always make mistakes in what they write? Do you think that if God exists, he would be capable of using humans to write down exactly what he wants written? If not, why not? Why would that not be possible? Just a series of questions that would come out in the vein of this first step of the Columbo tactic. What do you mean by that? These are just some variations of that. And then finally, scene 4, you're sitting at the car dealer, watching TV and waiting with other customers for your car to be serviced. Television news program highlights religious groups trying to influence important moral legislation. The person sitting next to you says, haven't these people ever heard of separation of church and state? Those Christians are always trying to force their views on everyone else. You can't legislate morality. Why don't they just leave the rest of us alone? Other people are listening. You don't want to create a scene, but you feel you must say something. What's your next move? On the next page, he gives some of this response. Do you vote? When you vote for someone, are you expecting the candidate to pass laws reflecting your own viewpoint? Wouldn't that essentially be forcing your viewpoint on others? How is that different from what you are troubled about here? Is it your view that only non-religious people should be allowed to vote or participate in politics, or did I misunderstand you? Where specifically in the Constitution are religious people excluded from the political process? Again, just see this method borne out here with the Columbo method in those tactics. Now, one of the things that I think's one of the interesting things here is just how he is focused on asking questions. He's focused on not taking the burden of proof upon himself. He's focused on moving the conversation forward in a very gracious way, but also a challenging way to the way that people are thinking. I want to try to read through chapter 6 next week. Basically, we're going to finish part 1, the game plan. And then the following week, I just want to look at a couple of these different flaws that you can find when people are communicating their ideas. But if you can read through chapter 6 next week, and then we'll look at step 2 and step 3 of the Columbo method. And then I also want to give some other questions that I find myself using a lot just in evangelistic scenarios in terms of transitions. Or what's really hard is when you're talking to somebody and you ask them a question and they dogmatically answer your question, but they answer it completely wrong as compared to the Bible. And it's like, oh, where do I go from here? Because you don't want to say, well, you're wrong, because that's not going to come off very well. But what kind of questions can you ask to challenge them and steer them back to the truth? There's been some that I've just used over the years that I've found helpful that tend to come off more gracious than me just telling them something. I'll share some of those with you next week as well. Lord, I just appreciate the comments tonight. I appreciate the heart of these individuals to desire to share your word with others. What you have done is so amazing that we have the most amazing message in the world. We really do, and it's exciting. There's nothing dull about it. We just need wisdom, Lord, because many people don't realize they need Jesus Christ. And so we need wisdom to introduce that topic and to communicate the value of what he accomplished for us. We pray that you would guide us, as Dean said, that you would not only open doors for us, but as you open those doors, that you would give us boldness to go through the doors, to start conversations, to look for opportunities to transition conversations to gospel conversations, Lord, and just give us wisdom to know how to do that. Make us excellent and quick learners in this area of graciously asking questions and graciously asking questions that challenge thinking. Give us a peace and give us wisdom and give us creativity of thought. Allow us to think quickly on our feet. Some of us don't think quickly on our feet, and so we're scared to death to try anything like this, but we believe you can do that, Lord, in the situations you've designed us for, where we can just start leaving out small pebbles everywhere in our sphere of influence. And that's our prayer. We thank you again, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.